The alarm sounded at 0530, a sharp electronic tone that split the Texas morning like a blade across still water. But Sergeant Ethan Cross had been standing in the middle of the Fort Caldwell training yard for 15 minutes already. Arms folded over his chest, jaw tight, boots planted wide in the red clay dust. Staring at the personnel transfer form someone had left on his desk the previous evening. The paper was already creased from how many times he had folded and unfolded it during the night. A civilian kennel logistics specialist. A woman. The Jeep came through the eastern gate at 0544, headlights cutting pale tunnels through the pre-dawn gray. It rolled to a stop in front of Kennel Block Alpha, and the woman who stepped out was not what 200 soldiers lining up for morning formation had expected. Though none of them would have admitted they were watching. She was small, not frail, but compact in the way that civilian women sometimes were. The kind of build that looked ordinary next to combat gear and tactical vests. Brown hair pulled back into a practical knot. Metal-framed glasses that caught the flicker of the kennel floodlights. Her khaki civilian uniform had a crease along one shoulder that suggested she had slept during the drive from the regional logistics office, and she carried nothing but a canvas tote bag and a manila folder tucked under one arm. She stood beside the Jeep for a moment after it pulled away, looking at the kennel block the way someone looks at a place they already know, not reading the signs, not orienting herself, just confirming. Cross covered the distance in 12 strides. He stopped close enough that the height difference was obvious to everyone watching. Iris looked up at him without adjusting her posture, without taking a step back. "You're the one they sent to replace Dr. Gable?" Cross asked. He pitched his voice at a volume that carried to the edge of the formation line. A calculated choice. 200 pairs of ears, and he wanted every one of them to register this moment as clearly as he did. The woman looked at him for a beat. Then she nodded once. "Name?" "Iris," she said. Her voice was level in a way that held no particular emotion, not defiance, not nervousness. Just information, delivered plainly, the way someone answers a question they have answered 10,000 times. Cross looked her over from the boots up. Civilian footwear with soft soles. No rank insignia, obviously, no visible equipment. On her right hand, a plain silver ring. No stone, no engraving visible from this distance. He noted it anyway, filed it away, and forgot about it within seconds because there was nothing in her appearance that suggested it mattered. "Listen carefully, Iris." He dropped the courteous register entirely and let his command voice take over, deliberate, unhurried, the tone of a man who had never once been interrupted in this yard. This is the highest-rated K9 combat unit in the United States Army. These animals are not therapy dogs. They are not pets. They are weapon systems with 4 legs and teeth, and every person who works with them has either years of certified handler training or an advanced veterinary degree. He paused. "You have neither. Your job is to fill water troughs, clean enclosures, log feeding schedules, and stand clear when we conduct actual operations. Are we understood?" "Understood, Sergeant," Iris said. The words were agreeable. The face beneath them was not unreadable. It was simply still. Not the stillness of someone suppressing rage, and not the stillness of someone hurt. Something more fundamental than either. The stillness of someone who has already assessed a situation and decided it does not require a reaction. Sergeant Raymond Boyle, standing 6 feet to Cross's left, let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. A short exhalation through the nose. The kind of sound that communicates contempt while maintaining plausible deniability. A few of the handlers along the formation line exchanged glances. Specialist Caleb Hurst, 22 years old and the newest certified handler in the unit, stared straight ahead and said nothing. His jaw worked slightly, the way it did when he wanted to speak and was choosing not to. Cross had already turned back toward the formation before Iris reached down to pick up her canvas bag. What happened next was small enough that most people missed it entirely. From behind the chain-link barriers of Kennel Block Alpha, 12 heads turned simultaneously, 12 pairs of nostrils lifted, and Ghost, the black Belgian Malinois at the far end of the run, the animal that had put his teeth into 3 different handler candidates in the past 6 months and sent the last one to the infirmary for 4 stitches, pressed both front paws against the chain-link fencing and began to scratch. Ghost had not scratched at that fence for a visitor in 11 months. Corporal Mason Reed, 26 years old, and the handler assigned to the morning kennel walk, watched the dog. He watched the new woman. He said nothing, but he stopped what he was doing and stood very still in the way of someone whose instincts have fired without yet delivering a clear message. Iris walked toward Kennel Block Alpha with her manila folder, and she did not look back. The first thing she did after receiving her orientation packet from Mason was walk the enclosures. This was standard. Even civilian logistics personnel needed a safety orientation before working near military working dogs. What was not standard was the way she did it. She kept precise distance from each kennel gate, not reading the posted clearance zones from the laminated safety cards. She already knew them. Her feet found the correct standoff distance from each enclosure without hesitation, and she maintained it through all 12 stations, with the consistency of someone whose body had internalized the measurement long ago. Muscle memory did not announce itself. It simply moved. At Ghost's enclosure, she stopped. The Malinois came to the gate immediately, not with the hard, forward-weighted aggression that had greeted every handler candidate before her, but with something quieter. Head slightly low, ears soft, body angled sideways in a posture that trainers called the oblique approach. It was what a dog did when it recognized a person, rather than assessing a stranger. Iris put her hand on top of Ghost's head. 2 seconds. She did not scratch or pet. Just placed her palm there, felt the animal settle under the weight of it, then continued down the line. Boyle saw it from across the yard. His voice carried like a thrown stone. "That dog bites! Get away from the gate!" "He's fine," Iris said, without turning around. Boyle's expression shifted into something that had moved past annoyance and was approaching something more invested. The particular discomfort of a man who has been contradicted by someone he has already decided does not count. Ghost sat down behind the gate and watched Iris walk away. His tail moved once. By mid-morning, Dr. Fern Walsh had arrived for the quarterly health review. She was the unit's contracted military veterinarian, a compact woman in her early 40s, with close-cropped red hair and the precise, economical movements of someone who had spent 20 years working around animals that could cause serious injury if she moved wrong. She had been the unit's vet for 3 years. She knew the dogs. She did not know Iris. She found the new kennel specialist sitting at the intake desk with a medical history binder open, making notes in a narrow, even hand. "I'll need the supplemental vaccination records for Ghost before the exam," Dr. Walsh said, setting down her bag. "The main file shows the base schedule, but his reinforcement shots from February aren't listed." Iris looked up from her notes. February 14th, leptospirosis booster, 0.5 milliliter volume. He had a localized reaction at the injection site, mild swelling, resolved within 72 hours. Dr. Gable documented it as a note rather than a formal adverse event because it fell below the reporting threshold. It should be in the supplemental file under tab 7. Dr. Walsh stared at her. Then she reached for the supplemental binder, turned to tab 7, and found the note exactly where Iris had said it would be. The swelling documentation, the date, the volume, every detail. She set the binder down. "That file is part of the classified health record set," she said carefully. "It's not on the standard civilian access list." Iris held her gaze without blinking. "I read fast, Doctor." Walsh picked up her bag and walked to Ghost's enclosure, but she did not immediately begin her examination. She stood with her hand on the gate latch for a moment, thinking about the way Iris had answered, not what she said, but the half-second of stillness before she said it, the quality of a person choosing words rather than recalling them. She filed the thought somewhere and did not take it out again until later. The afternoon brought Sergeant Boyle and a demonstration of the kind of small, sustained cruelty that does not leave visible marks. The unit's daily feeding logs were kept in a binder that lived on the desk outside the kennel office. Iris had been working on them for 2 hours, updating intake weights, cross-referencing appetite scores, noting that Ranger in Enclosure 9 had eaten only 60% of his morning portion, which was consistent with his documented PTSD-adjacent stress response, but worth flagging. It was careful, detailed, accurate work. Boyle walked past the desk with a water container in one hand. His elbow caught the corner of the binder. The container tipped. A full liter of water spread across the desk in the particular unstoppable way that liquids move in slow motion when you know exactly what is happening but cannot stop it, soaking 3 hours of handwritten entries, the paper going translucent, the ink beginning to run. My hand slipped, Boyle said. He looked directly at Iris when he said it. He had the particular stillness of someone waiting for a reaction. Iris looked at the ruined binder. Then she looked up at Boyle with an expression that was not anger and not resignation. She said quietly, "No problem, I remember it all." She pulled the wet pages out carefully, set them aside, took a fresh sheet from the supply cabinet, and began rewriting from memory. The intake weights, the appetite scores, the note about Ranger's 60% portion. She did not look at any reference material. The numbers came out of her in the same narrow, even handwriting, without pause, without hesitation. Boyle stood there for a moment, longer than was natural. Then he walked away. Mason Reed had witnessed all of it from the far end of the corridor. He had started walking toward the desk when the water spilled, but Boyle had looked at him, one flat look, and Mason had stopped. He stood now with his arms at his sides, watching Iris write, and felt the specific shame of someone who had the impulse to act and chose not to. Before we go any further, Iris just made her first mistake in Cross's eyes. She walked past the equipment shed without being told where it was. She knew exactly where it was. If you're already putting the pieces together, you're not alone, but trust us. What's coming is bigger than you think. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the moment everything changes. Now, let's get back to Fort Caldwell, because the dogs are already acting strange, and nobody can explain why. Master Sergeant Aaron Tate arrived that afternoon for what was listed on the weekly schedule as a program compliance review, a quarterly visit from the regional K9 training authority that was, in practice, an assessment of whether Cross was running his unit to standard. Tate was 51 years old, 30 years in service, and had the particular bearing of a man who had stopped needing to prove anything to anyone roughly 15 years ago. He reviewed files, he watched training exercises, he asked precise questions and waited for imprecise answers. He found Iris at the far end of the training yard, watching the afternoon formation drill from the permitted civilian observation zone, a strip of gravel behind a yellow line that kept non-handlers 30 feet from active training operations. She was standing with her arms at her sides, her weight perfectly balanced, her eyes tracking not the handlers, but the dogs. Tate stopped beside her. He did not introduce himself. "You have an opinion on the Zeus problem from this morning?" he asked. His tone was not conversational. It was the tone of a test. Iris did not look at him. The Eastern backup generator runs a 60 Hz frequency when it's been idle for more than 48 hours and then restarts. Zeus responds to frequencies in that range. He's got a sensitivity profile in his file. The generator maintenance log shows it was last serviced 22 days ago. He wasn't defying the command. He was being flooded with a signal your equipment was broadcasting. She paused. The maintenance schedule needs to be adjusted. Tate was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he walked to the facilities officer and confirmed the maintenance log. Then he walked back, looked at Iris for a moment, and walked away without saying anything else. 2 hours later, the facilities team confirmed the generator had been running irregular at 60 Hz. Zeus's sensitivity profile was on file. Every detail she had named was correct. Tate updated his notes. He did not write down what he was thinking. Evening settled over Fort Caldwell, with the particular weight of Texas summer heat releasing slowly from concrete and packed earth, the sky going from brass to deep blue without much transition in between. The duty day was done. The handlers had filed out. Cross had locked the command post and driven off base for dinner. Boyle had gone with him. The kennel block was quiet. Iris sat cross-legged on the concrete floor in the center of the runs, equidistant from all 12 enclosures. She had not turned on the overhead lights. The amber safety lights ran low along the floor, and in their warm half-light, the dogs were visible as shapes. Ghost nearest to her, then Rex, then Ranger, then the others in their various postures of rest or watchfulness. She did not speak. She did not offer food or toys. She simply sat, and the quality of her stillness was different from the stillness she maintained in Cross's presence. This was not performed, not controlled. It was the stillness of someone who was exactly where they intended to be. One by one, over the course of 20 minutes, all 12 dogs settled. Ghost pressed his side against the gate of his enclosure, closest to where she sat. Ranger, who had refused to lie down in his enclosure during the day for the past 8 months, folded himself onto his side and let out a long, slow breath. Outside, Through the high kennel windows, the Texas stars were beginning to appear. Mason Reed came back for a forgotten water bottle and found the lights off. He stopped in the doorway, looking into the dim amber space where 12 combat-trained military working dogs lay in various attitudes of rest around a small woman sitting silently on the floor. He stood there for nearly a minute. Then he picked up his water bottle, turned off his flashlight, and left without disturbing anything. He lay awake for a long time that night, trying to put a name to what he had seen. The next morning began with Specialist Caleb Hurst's training log and an observation that nobody wanted to say out loud. Titan broke pattern again, Hurst said, setting the log on Cross's desk. Third session in a row. He initiates the search correctly, runs the first 60% of the detection grid, and then he stops and reorients toward the kennel block. Cross did not look up from his own paperwork. Handler error. With respect, Sergeant, I've run this drill 400 times. My timing is... Handler error, Cross repeated, and his tone closed the conversation like a door being shut on a wind. Hurst took his log and left. He walked to the kennel block, where Iris was mixing supplemental vitamins into the morning feed. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her hands move with the quick, assured competence of someone who knows the exact ratios without measuring. Can I ask you something? She didn't stop working. Sure. How long have you worked with dogs? Iris continued mixing feed for a moment. A while, she said. Hurst looked at Titan, who was watching Iris from his enclosure with the focused, locked-on attention of an animal tracking something important. He keeps breaking pattern toward here, Hurst said. I don't know what to do with that. Iris set down the mixing bowl. She looked at Titan. Then she said something that Hurst would think about for a long time after. He's not breaking pattern. He's following one you can't see. She went back to mixing the feed. Hurst stood there another moment, then walked back to the training yard with no clearer answer than he'd arrived with, but with the feeling, vague and persistent, that he'd been told something important. It was Dr. Walsh who first said the words out loud, though she said them quietly and to only one person. She found Mason Reed checking water levels in the afternoon. She came to stand beside him, and she kept her voice below the level where it might carry. The notations Iris made in the supplemental health records, she said. I went back through them last night. She's using phantom coding protocol. Mason looked at her. What? Phantom Pack. It was a classified special operations K9 program. I saw the notation system once, in a classified briefing about 4 years ago. They had a specific way of logging behavioral observations that no other program uses, shorthand symbols in the margin. She picked up a feeding chart that Iris had filled out and turned it so Mason could see the corner. There, small and neat, were 3 symbols that looked like nothing in particular unless you knew what you were looking at. Those aren't random, those are phantom behavioral codes. Mason stared at the symbols. She could have read them somewhere. The documentation for Phantom is classified above this unit's access level. Fern kept her voice very even. It's not available to civilian logistics personnel. It's barely available to me. They looked at each other. The sound of the training yard, commands, movement, equipment, continued beyond the kennel walls. What do we do with that? Mason asked. Dr. Walsh took the feeding chart back and replaced it in its slot. I don't know yet, she said, but I think we keep watching. The following day arrived with the kind of heat that makes the air above concrete shimmer in visible waves, and Master Sergeant Aaron Tate returned, this time not for a scheduled review, but because he had made a call the previous evening that he wasn't going to discuss with Cross. He found Iris in the far enclosure, inside Ranger's kennel. No protection gear, no handler escort. He stopped dead at the sight of it. Ranger was a former Kandahar search and detection dog, 8 years old, retired from active deployment after an IED event, had taken his handler and left Ranger with a behavioral profile that the welfare team had categorized as unsuitable for reintegration into active duty. He had been scheduled for transfer to a medical assessment facility for the past 7 months. In that time, he had not allowed a single person inside his enclosure without a threat response. Ranger was lying on his side with his chin on Iris's knee. Tate stood very still outside the gate and watched. Iris was not doing anything obvious, not offering treats, not using a clicker, not running any recognizable desensitization protocol. She was simply sitting with the animal in a posture of complete calm, one hand resting on his side, her breathing slow and unhurried. After nearly 2 minutes, Tate said quietly, How long has he been like this? About 20 minutes, Iris said without moving. He put Sergeant Patterson in the infirmary 4 stitches deep 8 months ago. I know, Iris said. Tate looked at the dog. He looked at the woman. He reached into his jacket pocket and checked his phone, where a database query he had submitted the previous night was still showing as pending. He put the phone away. What's your background? He asked. Logistics and animal husbandry, Iris said. The job listing said that was the qualification. Tate nodded slowly, the nod of a man who has been given a technically accurate non-answer and knows it. He looked at Ranger once more, then walked back toward the command post. Behind him, he heard nothing. No sound of the dog startling, no protest, no alarm. He did not look back. He placed a second call that afternoon. This one went higher. The notification about the upcoming large-scale exercise came at the end of the afternoon formation. Cross delivered it with the particular energy of a man who had been waiting to say something important and has finally arrived at the moment. He stood before the assembled unit, 12 handlers, technical support staff, administrative personnel, the civilian contractors, and laid it out. End of week, we are running the full multi-phase combat simulation. This is not a standard training evolution. This is a live assessment with general officer observers from Washington. The outcome of this exercise affects the program's budget allocation for the next 5 fiscal years. He paused to let that settle into the silence. Every handler will perform to standard. Every dog will perform to standard. The scenario involves chemical attack simulation, trench system navigation, and exfiltration under time pressure. Another pause. Nothing about this week's exercise will be compromised by operational inconsistency, personnel issues, or any other factor within this unit's control. His eyes moved across the assembled personnel and landed on Iris with the precision of a directed charge. The look lasted less than a second. She was writing in her logistics notebook and did not look up. Caleb Hurst, standing in the handler line, watched Cross's face during that brief flare of directed focus. He looked at Iris. He looked at the notebook. He felt the weight of something he couldn't name pressing against the inside of his chest. That evening, he found Iris at the water station and made a decision he hadn't entirely planned. The exercise Thursday, he said. The safe observation zone for non-handler personnel is going to be different than usual because of the trench layout. I could walk you through it so you know where to stand. Iris looked up at him. Something moved briefly across her expression. Not quite warmth, not quite amusement. Thank you, Specialist. I'll be fine. Hurst nodded. Right, sure. He started to walk away, then stopped. He turned back. She's going to be fine, he said, apparently to no one, then walked back toward the barracks. Mason Reed, who had overheard this, watched Iris for a moment and then said more quietly, Is there anything you actually need from any of us? Iris capped her pen and thought about the question as though it deserved genuine consideration. No, she said finally, but I appreciate that you asked. She walked back to the kennel block. Mason stood in the yard a moment longer, listening to the Texas evening settle in around Fort Caldwell, and wondered why the answer to that question had made him feel, strangely, better and worse at the same time. General Floyd Harmon arrived on the base at 1400 hours the following day, 48 hours before the scheduled exercise, and he arrived without advance notice. This was characteristic of him. He had commanded 2 theaters of operation and currently served as the senior oversight authority for special operations training programs across 3 regional commands, and one of the things he had learned over 31 years of service was that the condition of a unit between inspections told you more than the condition of the unit during them. He cleared his vehicle at the main gate, declined the protocol escort, and walked the perimeter of the training facility alone for 20 minutes before approaching the kennel block. He stopped at the edge of the yard. Iris was rearranging the outdoor enclosure layout, moving the individual run barriers into a configuration that was, from Harmon's elevated vantage at the yard's edge, unmistakably a defensive perimeter array. Not the standard parallel row kennel organization. Not a random adjustment for cleaning access. A specific tactical pattern, covered positions, overlapping sight lines, maximum coverage of the approaches from the north and east. It was the layout used in one program, one specific classified program that had been operational for 4 years before being suspended 18 months ago. Harmon did not move for nearly 30 seconds. Then he reached into his breast pocket and took out a tablet computer. He opened a database, typed in a personnel query, and began reading the civilian logistics record that came up. The file was clean: standard civilian qualifications, logistics certification, animal husbandry background, no military service history, no red flags. Nothing that would explain what he was looking at in that yard. He scrolled down. At the bottom of the file, in a field that most readers would overlook as a routine administrative code, there was a classification flag. A small red indicator with a 2-letter prefix he recognized immediately. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked back at the yard, where Iris was continuing her enclosure adjustment, with the focused, unhurried efficiency of someone completing a task she had completed hundreds of times before. His tablet stayed in his hands, but he stopped scrolling. He began to walk toward the kennel block. The night before the exercise, Boyle circulated a theory through the handler barracks that he delivered with the casual confidence of someone certain of his audience. "Word from Logistics Division," he said, leaning against the doorframe of the common room where 4 handlers were cleaning equipment. "The kennel specialist, she's press, investigative journalist, embedded with civilian contractor credentials. She's writing about the K9 program." He let that land. "So, watch what you say around her." By morning, it had moved through the unit the way these things always do. Faster than fact, slower than silence. 3 handlers who had been cautiously collegial to Iris in the hallways stopped making eye contact. 2 others began watching her with a new kind of surveillance, the vigilant attention of people looking for confirming evidence rather than truth. Cross pulled Iris into the command post at 0800. He did not offer her a seat. "Are you affiliated with any news organization, media outlet, or civilian journalism publication?" "No," Iris said. "I'm going to verify that." "You should," she said. "You won't find anything." Cross looked at her for a moment with the focused intensity of a man trying to catch a tell. Iris returned the look with the same steady absence of visible concern she had brought to every other interaction since arriving. He dismissed her. The background check came back clean, as she had said it would. Cross forwarded the results to Boyle without comment. Boyle did not retract the rumor. He simply allowed it to exist in an uncertain state, which served the same purpose. Captain Connor Blake observed all of this from the periphery of the command post, in the quiet administrative role he had occupied for 2 weeks, without anyone examining too closely. He was not, technically, required to be at Fort Caldwell. His transfer paperwork listed a routine interbase coordination assignment. It was accurate on every line, and none of the lines explained why he was there. That afternoon, he found Iris alone in the supply corridor. He put a satellite phone in her hand, matte black, no commercial branding, encrypted to a frequency that civilian telecommunications infrastructure could not identify. "Report is due," he said. Iris looked at the phone. "Timeline still holds?" "General Harmon is already on base," Connor said. "He's ahead of schedule." Iris nodded once. Connor walked away. She looked at the phone for a moment, then put it in her pocket and went back to preparing the evening feed rotation. Right now, 12 military working dogs are refusing standard recall commands from their certified handlers, but responding instantly to a woman who is supposed to be cleaning their kennels. General Floyd Harmon just pulled up the classified database, and his hands stopped moving over the keyboard. He is staring at something that should not exist. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, share it with someone who loves military loyalty. We will be right back, and the next 60 seconds will change everything. The morning of the exercise arrived at 0500, with the kind of Texas dawn that comes in, clear and flat and hard, light spreading across the Fort Caldwell training grounds without ceremony. The combat training trench system, a half-mile of interconnected channels, junctions, and covered positions that the base engineers had spent 6 months constructing to simulate the tactical environments of Fallujah and Kandahar, ran along the eastern edge of the facility behind chain link and warning tape, waiting. 212 personnel, 12 handler dog pairs. An observation platform to the north, where 3 general officers from Washington had set up with tablets and radio equipment. General Harmon on the ground, moving through the assembly area with the quiet authority of someone who had decided to be closer to the action than was strictly necessary. Aaron Tate managing the technical coordination from the central command post. Cross in the front of his unit, chin up, shoulders back, the compressed energy of a man about to prove something. And Iris in the civilian observation strip, behind the yellow line, canvas tote bag at her feet, notebook open. The first phase began without incident. The simulation protocol called for a chemical agent deployment in the Western Trench corridor, with the handler teams moving the K9 units through the contamination zone using search and detection protocols. Ghost detected the marker compound in 42 seconds. Duke cleared the secondary grid. Rex and Storm swept the junction points in sequence. The timing was clean. The dogs performed. Cross allowed himself a small private adjustment in posture that was almost satisfaction. The second phase was where it changed. The facilities technician's voice came through Cross's radio at 8:22 a.m., flat and controlled in the specific way of someone who has just received information they do not want to transmit. Command, this is facilities. We are showing an anomalous pressure reading in the eastern ventilation system. The simulation compound delivery mechanism in Hatch 7 may not be running simulation compound. Cross keyed his radio. Say again. Sir, the ventilation interlock on Hatch 7 was logged for maintenance 3 weeks ago. If the interlock did not reseat correctly, the thermal compound in the delivery system is actual smoke, not simulation marker. We cannot confirm remotely. The generator fault from 2 days ago may have affected the control circuit. In the trench system's eastern corridor, Rex lifted his head. Storm, 20 feet further in, turned in a full circle and sat down facing the hatch. Neither dog advanced. Caleb Hurst, holding Rex's lead, said quietly into his radio, "Something is off." Cross stepped to the edge of the trench perimeter. He looked at the monitors. 2 of the 4 screens showing the eastern corridor had gone dark, victim of the same electrical fault that had taken down the generator. He looked at his handlers in the field. He looked at the observation platform where the Washington generals were watching. He looked at the timeline on his clipboard. "Continue the exercise," he said into the radio. "Dogs are responding to simulation stress. That is expected and within normal parameters." Mason Reed, in the central junction with Ghost, did not move. Ghost's head was low, his nostrils working fast. His weight shifted forward in the particular stance that the behavioral logs described as a confirmed source alert. Not a stress response, a detection. "Ghost is giving a source alert," Mason said into the radio. "That's different from stress response, Sergeant." "Continue the exercise, Corporal. That is an order." Iris closed her notebook. She looked at the eastern trench. She looked at the ventilation hatch indicators on the schematic board mounted near the civilian observation strip. The schematic that was posted there for emergency evacuation guidance, a standard safety requirement that most people never read. She read it in the time it took to exhale. She stepped over the yellow line. "Civilian personnel, return to the observation zone," said the nearest NCO, following protocol. Iris was already walking. She covered the 30 feet to the trench entry at a pace that was not quite running, controlled, directed, the pace of someone who knows where they are going and has decided that the relevant rules apply to a situation that no longer exists. Cross saw her and moved to intercept, closing the distance in quick, furious strides. "Stop right there." He planted himself in front of her. "You are a civilian contractor. This is an active training area. Turn around." Iris stopped. She looked at Cross with an expression that was still, for the last time, patient. "Your eastern ventilation valve in Hatch 7 has a failed interlock. The smoke building in that corridor is actual combustion byproduct from the thermal delivery mechanism, not simulation compound. Your dogs are not stress responding. Ghost and Rex are in confirmed source alert. If you send the teams further in on the current order, you are putting your handlers in an unventilated space filling with actual particulate smoke. That is a safety emergency, not a training scenario." Cross stared at her. His face had the quality of a man in the middle of 2 forces. The force of everything he had decided this woman was, and the force of what she had just said. "How do you know what a confirmed source alert looks like?" he said, and the question came out with less certainty than he intended. "Call your facilities team," Iris said. "Ask them to check the valve manually. You have approximately 4 minutes before the concentration in that corridor reaches a respiratory hazard threshold." Cross did not move for 2 seconds. Then he keyed his radio. The facilities technician confirmed the valve failure in 90 seconds. The interlock had not reseated. Actual combustion smoke had been building in the eastern corridor for 11 minutes. Cross ordered the Eastern teams to hold position and back out of the corridor. He ordered ventilation override from the central control. He did all of this with his back to Iris, and when it was done and the immediate threat was contained, he turned back around. "Who told you about the valve?" he said. "The maintenance log that was posted on the schematic board," she said. "It listed the valve as conditionally cleared. Conditionally cleared means the fault was partially addressed, but not fully resolved. Your technician's note was accurate." She paused. "It was in the evacuation documentation. Anyone could have read it. Nobody had, though. That much was clear." Cross had no answer for that. He stood with the radio in his hand and the particular expression of a man whose framework for understanding a situation has just developed a fault of its own. Behind him, at the trench perimeter, all 12 dogs were now oriented in a single direction. Not toward their handlers, not toward the smoke, toward Iris. 12 animals trained by different teams across different years, following no audible command, responding to no visible signal. All of them pointed at the same point like compasses finding north. Boyle saw it. The NCO saw it. 3 of the handlers saw it. Aaron Tate, walking up from the command post with his jaw set and his eyes moving fast across the scene, saw it. General Floyd Harmon, who had been approaching from the north path for the last 2 minutes, stopped walking when he was 15 feet from the perimeter. He looked at the dogs. He looked at Iris. He looked at the dogs again. He reached into his breast pocket. Cross turned toward Boyle to issue an instruction. Boyle moved toward Iris, not toward the situation, but toward the woman. The specific targeting motion of someone who has decided that she is the problem that needs to be removed from the scenario. His hand came out to take her arm. The sleeve of her khaki jacket caught. The fabric, civilian grade, and not cut for this kind of contact, pulled from the shoulder seam. She had not resisted. The sleeve simply did what fabric does when pulled incorrectly. It tore from the shoulder to just below the elbow. In the moment of silence that followed, 2 seconds, perhaps 3, in which the only sound was the distant hiss of the ventilation system correcting itself, every person within line of sight of Iris's right arm saw the same thing. From the point of her shoulder to the inside of her elbow, the skin bore a tattoo that was not decorative. It was precise. A wolf's head, rendered in the particular flat black style of operational unit insignia, facing left in the oblique, with 7 small stars arranged in an arc above it. Below the wolf's jaw, in lettering that was small but legible from 6 feet away, Phantom 7. Boyle's hand was still in the air. Cross had turned at the sound of the fabric tearing, and now stood with his mouth slightly open and no words in it. The 12 military working dogs of Fort Caldwell's K9 unit sat down simultaneously in the positions they had taken over the last 2 minutes and looked at the woman with the torn sleeve the way soldiers look at a commanding officer who has just entered the room. General Floyd Harmon lowered his tablet. The database record he had been pulling up for the last 48 hours, the one with the red classification flag, the one that had run into restricted access permissions he did not have the clearance to bypass from his standard device, the one that had required a second query through a different channel that had come back only an hour ago with a file that had made him change his plans for the exercise entirely. That file was open on his screen. He looked at the tattoo. He looked at the file. He said, in a voice that was very quiet and very certain, "Oh my God." Then General Floyd Harmon, 2 stars on his collar, 31 years of service, brought his right hand to his forehead in a full formal salute. He held it. In the training yard of Fort Caldwell, Texas, with 200 personnel watching and 12 dogs sitting at attention and 1 sleeve hanging from a civilian logistics specialist's arm, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The smoke from the eastern ventilation system had cleared. The sky above the trench system was the flat, enormous blue of a Texas morning. The silence lasted 4 seconds, and then it lasted 4 more, and in those 8 seconds, the world that Ethan Cross had been running for the past 2 years shifted completely on its axis. Iris looked at Harmon. She held his gaze. After a moment, she brought her arm down, the torn sleeve hanging, the tattoo visible to everyone. And she stood straight. "General," she said. "Major Ren," Harmon said, and he lowered his salute. The name landed in the open air of Fort Caldwell's training yard like a stone dropped into still water. And for 3 full seconds, the ripples had nowhere to go. Major Ren. 2 words. Harmon had spoken them at the same measured volume he used to issue operational orders, which meant they carried exactly as far as they needed to carry, and the yard was quiet enough that they carried far. The handlers heard it. The NCOs heard it. The 3 general officers on the observation platform, who had leaned forward in the practiced way of men accustomed to watching situations develop, heard it through their radio feed and then looked at each other. Cross heard it. He was standing 4 feet from Iris when the name hit him, and the effect was visible in the way that an impact is sometimes visible before the sound arrives. A slight backward shift in his weight, a fractional opening of his jaw, the expression of a man whose interior architecture has just received a structural notice it was not prepared for. He looked at Harmon. He looked at the tattoo on Iris's arm. Phantom 7, still exposed, the torn sleeve hanging. And the thing that moved across his face in the seconds that followed was not anger and not shame. It was something more fundamental than either. It was the look of a person trying to recalculate a position when the map they have been using turns out to be for a different country entirely. Sergeant Raymond Boyle had taken 2 steps back. His hands were at his sides now. The hand that had pulled the sleeve, that specific hand, he held slightly away from his body, not quite able to make a fist with it, not quite able to let it relax. He stared at the tattoo. He stared at Harmon's salute. He stared at the 12 dogs sitting in precise, patient formation around Iris. And his face did the thing faces do when the story a person has been telling themselves for days collapses in a single moment under the weight of evidence that was always there. Master Sergeant Aaron Tate stood perfectly still at the edge of the command post walkway, 30 feet from where all of this was happening. He had removed his glasses. He held them in one hand, the earpiece between his thumb and forefinger, and he looked at Iris with the expression of a man confirming something he had been unwilling to confirm until this moment. His lips moved once. Those close enough to read them would have seen 2 words, spoken to no one: still alive. Mason Reed was standing with Ghost's lead coiled in his hand, though Ghost had not needed the lead to hold position for the last 4 minutes. He was looking at Iris's arm, at the tattoo, at the vague peripheral awareness of Harmon's salute. And something in his face was doing something that he had not intended to let it do. The involuntary process of a person making sense of all the small things he had cataloged and set aside and quietly carried, arriving now at the understanding of what they added up to. The feeding logs written from memory, the vaccine dates, the Kai, Hugh, Tay in the training yard, the silence in the kennel block at night, Ranger lying on his side. The particular weight of a vow Ghost had made to someone that everyone else had been told was gone. Mason's eyes went red at the rim, not from the residual smoke. He blinked once, hard, and straightened his shoulders and looked at the middle distance because that was the only thing he could think to do with what he was feeling. Specialist Caleb Hurst reached for his phone out of instinct. The 22-year-old reflex of a person who encounters something extraordinary and immediately wants to make it permanent. His hand closed around it in his pocket, and then Mason's hand closed around Caleb's wrist. Not roughly, just firmly. "No," Mason said. Caleb looked at him, looked at Iris, looked at the phone in his pocket. Then he took his hand back and stood with his arms at his sides and watched with the rest of them, understanding without being told that this was the kind of moment you did not reduce to an image. You simply stood in it and let it do what it was going to do to you. Dr. Fern Walsh had come out of the medical station at the sound of the commotion, standard protocol for any unusual development during a training exercise, and she was standing near the kennel block entrance when Harmon saluted. She had her tablet under her arm, and she had seen everything from the moment the sleeve tore. She looked at the Phantom 7 inscription with the expression of a woman who has just heard the answer to a question she's been turning over in her mind for 3 days. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they were bright and steady. The 3 general officers on the observation platform had come down the stairs. This was not in the protocol for the exercise. They moved with the deliberate speed of very senior men who have decided that the situation has exceeded what can be observed from an elevated distance. The westernmost of the 3, a lean man in his early 60s with the particular posture of someone who had once been an airborne officer and had never fully let go of it, looked at Harmon. "Is that who I think it is?" Harmon lowered his salute and turned his head slightly. "Yes, sir." The file said she was. "The file was deliberately altered," Harmon said. "That is part of what she is here to confirm." The general looked at Iris for a long moment. He nodded once, slowly. with the gravity of someone paying a debt he had not known he owed. The moment of public stillness broke the way these things always break, not with a dramatic announcement, but with the resumption of practical necessity. The eastern ventilation system needed to be fully cleared. The exercise needed to be formally suspended. The handlers needed to stand down their dogs from alert posture. Life, in its operational requirements, moved forward whether or not the people living it had fully processed what had just happened. But the atmosphere that moved forward was not the same one that had existed before the sleeve tore. It was the same physical space, same sky, same concrete, same red clay dust. And it was completely different in the way that a room is different when someone turns on a light. Cross stood where he was for 11 seconds after Harmon lowered his salute. Then he walked to the command post. He did not look at Iris when he passed her. He sat down at the operations table and looked at the surface of it, and the look on his face was the particular look of a man who was not deciding what to do next, but sitting inside the understanding that the categories he has been using to navigate his decisions no longer apply. Boyle followed him in, because Boyle had always followed him, and when he sat down across from Cross, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not companionable. It was two men who had built something together, discovering simultaneously that they had been building on sand. Harmon did not immediately initiate the formal proceedings. He understood, from 31 years of managing people in situations of extreme pressure, that there was a sequence to these things, that the person at the center of a revelation had needs that existed prior to institutional process, and that addressing those needs was not sentimental but strategic. A person who has been operating under sustained stress at a high level, maintaining a cover identity for months in an environment of active hostility, needed 30 seconds of nothing before they could engage with anything. He stood near Iris without speaking. The dogs had relaxed from their formation posture, but had not dispersed. They remained near her, Ghost the closest. Ranger pressed against the fence of his run in the adjacent enclosure. The kennel block was quiet behind them. After 20 seconds, Iris said, "The valve failure wasn't an accident." "No," Harmon agreed. "I know." She turned her head to look at him. The maintenance log was modified after the original entry. The conditional clearance was added by someone with facility system access in the last 72 hours. It was designed to look like a genuine oversight. "That's consistent with what Connor's investigation has developed," Harmon said. "There are 3 people in this facility with the access level to modify that log." She paused. One of them had a financial relationship with a private contractor that was not disclosed in their security clearance renewal. Harmon's expression did not change. "We identified that in the last 12 hours. Iris nodded. "Then you have everything you need." Harmon looked at her for a moment. "We have most of what we need," he said. "The rest of what we need is your verbal confirmation of the chain, which will become part of the JAG submission when you're ready." "I'm ready now," she said. He almost smiled. "I know," he said, "but Dr. Walsh has been standing over there for 4 minutes trying to find a reason to approach you with medical supplies. And if you don't let her do something, she is going to vibrate out of her own boots." Iris turned to look at Dr. Walsh, who had indeed been standing at a respectful distance with a small trauma kit open in her hands, and the expression of a person exercising considerable professional restraint. The torn sleeve had exposed not just the tattoo, but the full length of the scar that Mason had glimpsed days ago, the long, rope-textured mark from Kuyu to shoulder that documented an IED event with more precision than any medical file could. Iris looked at the scar for a moment, as though seeing it from the outside for the first time. Then she walked to Dr. Walsh. "I'm not going to find anything alarming, am I?" Dr. Walsh said, beginning the examination with the quiet efficiency of long practice. "No," Iris said. "The scar is old. The sleeve catch reopened the lateral edge here. That's just superficial." Fern applied a dressing with the practice speed of someone who has done field medicine in conditions considerably more challenging than a training yard. Her hands were steady. Her voice was the voice she used when she was concentrating and did not want to show emotion. "Ghost stopped eating properly when they told us you were gone," she said, without looking up. Iris was quiet for a moment. "How long?" 8 days. Fern secured the edge of the dressing. "He started again when they put Rex in the adjacent enclosure. I think he accepted the company, but it was never quite the same." She looked up. "He knew before any of us did, this morning, when the Jeep came through the gate." Iris looked at Ghost. Ghost looked back at her with the unambiguous directness that dogs have and humans spend their whole lives trying to achieve. I know, Iris said. I heard him. Captain Connor Blake materialized at Harmon's elbow with the timing of someone who had been waiting for exactly this juncture. He carried a sealed red envelope and a tablet with a file already open on the screen, and his manner had shifted from the deliberately unremarkable administrative officer he had performed for 2 weeks into something more precisely defined. A senior investigative officer, completing the last operational step of a long and complicated assignment. He handed Harmon the envelope. Harmon broke the seal, read the contents, and passed it to the senior general from the observation platform, who had come to stand beside him. The general read it. The movement of his eyes slowed once, near the bottom of the page. Then he folded it and held it. Connor turned to Iris. 3 sources confirmed, he said quietly. The first 2 have been flagged for JAG processing. The third, he paused, and the pause had weight to it. The third submitted a voluntary disclosure this morning, 2 hours before the exercise, before the valve failure. Iris processed this. Who? That's going to be part of the formal briefing, Connor said. What I can tell you now is that the disclosure was complete and it is accurate, which is consistent with the investigation record. He looked at her steadily. It's someone who made a serious error in judgment and then made a harder choice. Iris said nothing for a moment. Then, is the program compromised beyond recovery? No, Connor said. The breach was on the administrative side. The operational data was not accessed. The dog's training records, the handler protocols, the field methodology, none of it reached the outside party. They were going for budget and personnel information. She let out a breath that was very small and very controlled. Then Phantom can be rebuilt. That's the recommendation in the submission, Connor said. He glanced at Harmon. Harmon nodded once. Connor looked back at Iris. With a different command structure, the implication of that landed in the space between them without requiring elaboration. Cross was called to Harmon's position at 1400 hours. He came across the training yard with the specific walk of a man who has not been formally relieved of command, but who understands from the behavior of every person he passes that the command he has been exercising is no longer what it was. Harmon waited for him near the trench entrance. Aaron Tate stood to Harmon's left. Connor Blake was 1 step back. Iris was not present for this conversation, which was deliberate. She was in the kennel block with Mason and the dogs, doing the practical work that the morning's emergency had interrupted, because that was who she was, and that was what she did. Harmon did not raise his voice. He spoke at the same measured volume he had used all morning. Sergeant Cross, your unit was placed at risk this morning because of an operational decision made without full situational awareness. That decision was compounded by instructions given to personnel to restrict access to information that was directly relevant to a safety emergency. He looked at Cross without heat or contempt, just the direct assessment of a general officer looking at a problem he is in the process of solving. You have been an effective training coordinator. Your program metrics are strong. None of that changes what happened today or what has been investigated over the past several weeks. He paused. You are suspended from operational command pending the outcome of JAG review. You will be fully represented in that process. Do you understand? Cross stood at attention. Yes, sir. You are dismissed from the training area. Administrative processing will begin at 0800 tomorrow. Cross held his posture for a moment longer than the response required. Then he said, not defiantly, but with the plain force of someone who needs to say a thing before walking away. I didn't know who she was. No, Harmon agreed. You didn't. He let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to sit. That is not the only thing that will be considered, Sergeant, but it will be considered. Cross walked off the training ground. The handlers watched him go. Nobody said anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said. The silence was not triumphant. It was the silence of people who have witnessed a consequence land and are processing the fact that consequences, when they arrive, are heavier and more complicated than anticipation makes them. Boyle was processed separately, in the command post, by 2 JAG-designated officers who had arrived on base that morning with Connor and had been waiting with the professional patience of people who are accustomed to waiting. His case involved more than the behavioral events of the past week. It involved the facility access logs and the maintenance record modification. That conversation took longer. Mason Reed found Iris at enclosure 9, where Ranger was standing at the gate with his tail moving in the slow, steady rhythm of an animal that has finally, after a long time, relaxed. Mason leaned against the wall of the corridor. He looked at the dog. He looked at the woman. He put his hands in his pockets, which was against regulation in this building, and he didn't care. "I want to apologize," he said, "for not doing anything earlier, when Boyle dumped the water on your logs, and other times." He said it plainly without a speech around it, the apology of someone who has decided it is better to say the insufficient thing than to say nothing. Iris didn't look away from Ranger. "You stopped Caleb from filming. That's not the same as." "It's not nothing either," she said. She turned to look at him, and the expression she carried was not absolution delivered easily. It was something more honest than that. The recognition of one person who has been in difficult situations for another. "You noticed. You kept noticing. You stayed." She paused. "In conditions like this, Mason, that counts." He nodded. He didn't trust his voice for a moment, so he waited until he did. "The key Hugh Tate, in the training yard, when Titan broke pattern. I saw your hand." "I know. How long were you going to hold the cover?" She thought about it. "Until I had what I came for, or until someone's safety required something different." She looked back at Ranger, who had laid down on his side again, the full, loose, horizontal position of an animal that feels genuinely safe. The valve failed faster than the projected timeline. The decision made itself. Mason was quiet for a moment, watching Ranger's sides move with each breath. "He slept standing up for 8 months, he said. Every single night. 3 different handlers tried behavioral modification protocols. None of it worked." He looked at Ranger lying flat on the kennel floor. "Whatever you do, don't tell the behavioral welfare team how long it took you, because they will be professionally humiliated." For the first time in 6 days, Iris laughed. It was small and brief and entirely unperformed, and it lasted about 2 seconds, and it changed the quality of the corridor the way sunlight changes a room when it finds a gap in the clouds. Mason looked startled. Then he smiled, not the careful smile he had been maintaining around her all week, but a real one. "There she is," he said, and immediately looked slightly alarmed at having said it out loud. "There who is?" Iris asked, going back to her notes. "Nobody," Mason said. "Forget I said anything." He pushed off the wall and began his evening walk of the enclosures, and he was still smiling when he reached enclosure 12. Stay with us for the final chapter, and drop a comment below. Did you figure out who Iris really was before the dogs gave it away? Specialist Caleb Hurst came at the end of the evening, after the duty day was officially concluded, and the base had settled into the quieter rhythms of post-exercise recovery. He knocked on the kennel office doorframe. Iris was at the desk, completing the maintenance request that would formally document the valve failure and the modified log entry, the paperwork that would become part of the JAG record. He stood in the doorway with the posture of someone who has rehearsed what they want to say and has lost confidence in all versions of it. "Rex," he said finally, "I've been his handler for 14 months. I was assigned to him when he came back from Kandahar, after the event, after his previous handler." He stopped. He looked at the floor. "I know he was yours before that. I mean, I know that now. I didn't know it before today." Iris set down her pen and gave him her full attention. Hurst looked up. "I just wanted to say, I've done my best with him. I know he's had a hard road, and I know I'm not—" He stopped again, because the sentence didn't have a good ending. He started a different one. "When Phantom comes back online, if it comes back online, I want to be considered, if there's a selection process." He held her gaze. "I know I have a lot to learn. I know there's a lot I probably don't even know. I don't know yet. But Rex, he's mine to look after. He has been for 14 months. And I would like the chance to do that properly." Iris was quiet for a moment. "You already are," she said. 14 months of consistent care for an animal with his history is not a small thing, Caleb. The work you've done shows in how he moves, how he responds, how he reads a room." She picked up her pen again. "Selection is a process, not a conversation. But the conversation you just had is consistent with the kind of person who gets through selection." Hurst nodded. He was working to keep his expression professional. "Thank you, Major." "Get some rest," she said. "You have a morning maintenance run at 0600 and Rex's post-exercise assessment at 0800. And I suggest you have your handler log updated before the assessment because the reviewing officer is going to check the chronology. Hurst blinked. The reviewing officer for tomorrow's assessment is, "Get some rest, specialist." He left with an expression that suggested he was going to be awake for a while, but for reasons entirely different from the ones that had kept him up the previous nights. Doris Keene found Iris near the water station at the edge of the kennel yard, in the blue-gray hour that preceded full dark. Doris was 63 and had worked 3 different assignments at 3 different bases over 30 years, and she had the particular unhurried quality of someone who no longer has any performance left in her. She was entirely herself, all the way down, which made her both easy to underestimate and easy to trust. She didn't lead with anything. She stood beside Iris and looked at the fading sky for a moment. "Your father talked about Fort Caldwell," she said finally, "the last year before he retired. He said it was one of the programs he was proudest of." She paused. "He said the people who went through it came out different, that the dogs changed them." Iris looked at the kennel block, where the amber safety lights were coming on one by one as the evening deepened. "He was right about that. He worried about you," Doris said, "not in the way that fathers worry about children, in the way that commanding officers worry about people they've trained. That particular kind, the one where you've given someone everything you know, and then you have to watch them go, do something with it that you can't control." She paused. "He told me once that you were the best thing the program ever produced. He said it mattered to him that you knew that." Iris was quiet for a long time. The last of the Texas light ran out of the sky above the fence line. Somewhere in the kennel block, Ghost made a single sound. Not quite a bark, softer than that. The sound a dog makes when it is checking that something it cares about is still there. "He was the best commanding officer I ever served under," Iris said. Her voice was very even. "Everything I am in that kennel block, he built." Doris nodded. She did not say anything else for a while, because the silence was doing something useful, and she had the wisdom to let it. After a time, Iris said quietly, "He'd have hated the cover assignment. He thought civilians were underestimated at a systemic level, and he spent considerable energy correcting that institutional bias." She almost smiled. "Being one would have driven him to distraction." Doris laughed. A full, warm laugh. The laugh of someone who had known the man and recognized him completely in the description. "He'd have lasted about 4 hours before he told someone what he actually thought." 3, Iris said. "He always overestimated himself in patient situations." They stood together in the darkening yard, and it was not a sad conversation, even in the places where it could have been. It was what it was, 2 people who had both been shaped by the same person in different ways, standing beside each other at the end of a very long day and honoring that shaping by saying the true things about it. Harmon's formal briefing took place in the command post at 1900 hours, with the attendance of 14 people who had been cleared for the content. The 3 Washington generals, Aaron Tate, Connor Blake, Dr. Walsh, Mason Reed, and a JAG officer who had arrived from the regional legal office. Iris sat at the table's edge rather than its head, which was characteristic. She put information into rooms rather than presiding over them. Connor Blake presented the investigation findings in 15 minutes, because that was how long 15 months of work took to communicate when it was organized correctly. 3 sources of phantom program data compromise. 2 active transmissions to a private security contractor operating under foreign investment. 1 voluntary disclosure, confirmed accurate, from a person whose identity would remain restricted pending cooperation and sentencing review. The foreign contractor in question had not received operational methodology, only budget structures and personnel classifications. The program itself, its training protocols, its handler dog bonding methodology, its communication system was intact, unbreached, still viable. When Connor finished, the senior general looked at Iris. "You spent 11 months in Syria before the cover reassignment?" "Yes, sir." "And the preceding period between the reported incident and your reassignment here?" "That period involved reconstruction of certain operational contacts and a separate classified activity that is documented in the submission, but is not relevant to today's proceedings." She paused. "I can brief separately, if required." The general looked at her for a moment, with the expression of a man choosing not to ask a question he has decided he will ask later, and in a different room. He turned a page in the document. He looked at the handler deployment records. He looked at the 12 behavioral assessments Dr. Walsh had filed that afternoon. One for each dog, each one a document that told the same story from a different angle. He set the documents down. Major Ren. He used the rank the way senior people use rank, when they mean it as recognition rather than protocol. When this program was suspended 18 months ago, the official assessment was that the methodology was not transferable, that the results depended too heavily on a single operator's approach and could not be replicated at scale. He looked at her steadily. I have spent the last 3 days watching 12 animals trained by that methodology outperform every program metric we have. I have watched them make a tactical decision, independently, under emergency conditions, that protected this facility and all the personnel in it. He paused. I want to know whether the assessment was wrong. Iris was quiet for a moment. The assessment confused the method with the person, she said. The method is teachable. What makes it work is not a particular individual's gift. It is a commitment to a specific kind of relationship between a handler and an animal. That relationship requires patience, time, and the willingness to treat the dog as a partner rather than a tool. She glanced briefly at Mason Reed, who was sitting along the wall and very carefully not reacting. Your people here have already started to understand it. They started on their own, before they knew what they were learning. The general nodded slowly. He looked at Harmon. Harmon met his gaze and held it. The program recommendation, the general said. Your proposed command structure. Yes, sir. I want to be direct, Major. The proposed commanding officer is listed as to be confirmed pending voluntary acceptance. He set the document down. That is an unusual phrasing. Yes, sir, Iris said. Is there a reason the phrasing is unusual? Because the officer in question has served under circumstances that make assuming command a matter of personal choice rather than assignment, and the program's oversight committee agreed that the distinction was worth preserving. The general looked at her steadily. Is the officer going to accept? Iris looked at the table, at her hands which were folded on the surface in the still, unhurried manner that characterized everything she did. Then she looked up. Yes, she said. The officer is going to accept. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Aaron Tate, who had been silent for most of the briefing, said from his position near the window, Welcome back, Major. And the 12 people in that room, who had spent the day moving from confusion to shock to the complicated settling of understanding, responded not with applause, because this was not that kind of room and these were not that kind of people, but with the specific quality of silence that means something has been resolved. Not concluded, not finished, but resolved. She found Ghost that night. Not to say something, not to deliver closure. She had been in that kennel block 6 consecutive evenings, and this was simply the 7th. She sat cross-legged on the concrete floor with the amber lights low and the rest of the base quiet around her, and Ghost came to the gate and pushed his shoulder against it the way he always had, and she put her palm on the top of his head the way she always had. 2 seconds, the weight of the hand, the acknowledgement. She looked at the 11 other shapes in the low light. Ranger on his side, in enclosure 9, breathing slow. Rex in enclosure 4, curled with his nose to his tail, the way he slept when he felt safe. Zeus standing at the back of his run, watching her with the steady, patient attention of a dog who has learned that watching is its own form of participation. Titan, Blaze, Duke, Storm, Axe, Kodiak, Shadow, Hunter. Each of them an argument made in fur and muscle and years of training and loyalty, for the premise that some things are worth coming back to. She had been told, in Syria, that there was no coming back, not to the program, not to the work, not to any of this. She had been told it in the specific language of institutional finality that leaves no room for interpretation, and she had sat with that information in a tent in a province that she would not name in this room, and she had decided, in the particular way that decisions are made when all the options are bad, that the information was wrong. 11 months. Then the phone call from Connor. Then 6 days of damp kennels and condescension and a water jug, tipped deliberately on 3 hours of careful work. And through all of it, the knowledge, not comfortable, but certain, that she was exactly where she needed to be. Ghost pressed his forehead against the gate. She pressed hers against the opposite side, briefly, in the old gesture that meant something she did not have words for and did not need them. Good boy, she said. His tail moved once. She stepped back from Ghost's gate, and went to each of the others in the sequence she had always used, the sequence that had nothing to do with enclosure numbers or the administrative order they appeared in on the official roster, but everything to do with the particular architecture of each animal's trust and what each of them needed in a farewell. Ranger, who had come so far in 6 days that the Welfare Committee's previous report read now like a document about a different dog. Rex, steady and loyal, and growing into something excellent under Caleb's careful, earnest attention. Zeus and Storm, Duke and Blaze. Each of them a professional, each of them more than what their jackets said. Titan, Axe, Kodiak, Shadow, Hunter. She went to each one. She did not rush. When she came back to Ghost at the end, he was waiting where she had left him, because that was what he did. She put her palm on his head for the last time. 2 seconds. The weight of it. Then she took her hand away, and she stepped back, and she looked at him across the space between them, and the thing between them was not sentiment and not performance. It was simply the truth of what they were to each other, which had existed before the crisis at Fort Caldwell, and would exist after it, carried forward in the particular permanent way of things that have been real. She had been in harder places than this. She had said harder goodbyes. But the goodbyes that are not permanent are in some ways harder than the ones that are, because they require the faith that what is being left behind will be intact when you return, that the interval will not have changed the fundamental thing. She had that faith. She had earned it 6 days ago, in a trench with 12 dogs who had refused to leave. On the 3rd day before her final preparations, she had done something she had not planned to do, and then had understood that she had always planned to do it, even without admitting it. She went to the administrative building and found Cross. He was at a desk in the interim office assigned to him for the review period, and he looked up when she came to the door with the expression of a man who has been braced for a number of possible visitors and had not anticipated this one. He did not stand. She did not ask him to. She stood in the doorway. She did not cross the threshold, which was deliberate. The choice of a person who was visiting and not entering, who was offering something without making it an occupation. "I'm not here to say anything satisfying," she said. "I'm not here to make a speech about what you got wrong because you already know. I'm here because the unit you ran has good people in it." She held his gaze without heat. Hurst has the instincts to be an exceptional handler if someone spends real time developing them. Reed has the judgment this work requires and the character that sustains it across a career. She paused. "Those things happened on your watch. That counts for something. I wanted you to know I think so." Cross looked at her for a long time. He looked at the torn edge of her khaki sleeve, which she had not replaced, the lower edge of the Phantom 7 inscription just visible. He looked at her face, which held the same quality of steadiness it had held through everything, not softened, not triumphant, not performing generosity, just the plain truth of her assessment, offered directly. "You could have shown the tattoo on day 1, he said. "All of it. It would have ended before it started." "It would have," she agreed. "But then I wouldn't have known who your people actually were, or who you were." She glanced toward the window, where the morning drill was audible through the glass. The investigation needed it, and frankly, she paused. The program needed it. What Phantom becomes next has to be built on accurate knowledge of what exists. You gave me that, even if not intentionally. Cross was quiet for a moment. "The JAG review. Will take as long as it takes," she said. "Whatever it finds, I think you understand that the decisions made in that yard were not sustainable. Not for the program, not for the people in it, and not for you." She held his gaze once more. "Real service doesn't require an audience, Cross. It doesn't need anyone to know what it costs. Your people were already understanding that. Hurst, Reed, Walsh. They were figuring it out slowly in the room you were running." She paused. "You just weren't looking." She turned and walked back toward the training yard. Cross sat in his interim office and looked at the surface of the desk and sat with the thing she had left him with, which was not comfortable and was not simple and was entirely, in its way, fair. Before all of that, there was the matter of the exercise itself. The Washington generals had arrived to observe a training assessment. What they observed instead was something that no field manual had a category for, and in the particular way of very senior people who have devoted their lives to the management of complex and unpredictable situations, they processed it with the adaptive efficiency of long experience. The exercise was formally suspended at 14:22 hours. The suspension was logged not as a failure, but as an operational reassessment, which was accurate and also covered the kind of administrative ground that prevents complications later. The senior general from the observation platform, the one who had asked Harmon whether it was who he thought it was and had received the answer and stood very still for a moment, sat down that afternoon with the other two Washington observers and a significant quantity of black coffee and talked for 90 minutes about what they had seen and what it meant and what the program looked like going forward. That conversation was not in any document, because some conversations shouldn't be, but its conclusions shaped every formal communication that followed it. What they had seen was not embarrassing, it was clarifying. 30 years of bureaucratic momentum in one direction, and 12 dogs had provided, in the space of 4 minutes and 12 seconds, the clearest possible argument for a different one. The formal consequence cascade began at 0800 the following morning, when the JAG officers initiated the processing sequence that would, over the following weeks and months, work through the institutional layers of what had happened at Fort Caldwell and apply appropriate weight to each of them. Cross's suspension became, in the weeks following, a formal investigation into command decisions that prioritized personal bias over operational safety. The valve situation being the clearest documented instance, but not the only one the review uncovered. His record would show what it would show. He was not, in the final assessment, a bad soldier. He was a soldier who had allowed certainty about what he knew to prevent him from seeing what he didn't. The distinction mattered, even if the outcome was the same. Boyle's case was more serious. The facility access logs showed his digital signature on the maintenance record modification, and the timeline placed the modification between the JAG-flagged financial contact and the exercise date. That case did not end at a suspension. The third source, the voluntary disclosure that Connor had referenced in the hallway, the person who had made a serious error and then made a harder choice, was not named publicly. Their cooperation with the investigation was complete, and their disclosure had been accurate. What happened to them after that was part of a process that moved through channels that this account does not follow, because some things are between a person and the institutional structures they operate within, and the judgment that belongs to those structures is not this story's to render. Aaron Tate spent the afternoon after the formal briefing walking the perimeter of the training yard alone, in the way of a man doing the kind of thinking that requires movement. He had spent 30 years in the business of assessing units and identifying problems and writing reports that described, as accurately as language allowed, what he had found. He was good at it. He had never had occasion to write a report like this one. He sat down at the desk in his temporary office at 1700 hours and began. He wrote for 2 hours because accuracy required that kind of time. He wrote about the behavioral anomalies he had observed in the K9 unit across the 3 days preceding the exercise. He wrote about the valve failure and the moment when the only person in the training yard who had the correct information was a civilian logistics specialist standing outside the yellow line. He wrote about 12 dogs making a decision that no handler had commanded them to make, and about what that decision had accomplished. He did not have language for some of what he had witnessed, so he was precise about what he did have language for, and he left the rest visible by its absence, the white space around what he wrote being as informative, for a careful reader, as the words themselves. His report confirmed that the K9 unit at Fort Caldwell was operating at exceptional standard. It recommended no budget reduction. It recommended expansion, contingent on the reinstatement of the Phantom Program Oversight Structure. He submitted it at 19:15 hours. He did not sleep well that night, but not from worry. He was trying to hold on to something he understood he might not see again. The sight of a general officer standing in a trench and saluting someone nobody else in that yard had recognized. The Washington generals submitted their own assessment, which went to a level above this account's visibility. What was visible was this. In the weeks following the exercise, something shifted in the kennel block. Not dramatically, not with announcement, but in the small daily register of how people moved through a space and what they said to each other in it. The handlers came earlier, they stayed later. They asked questions they hadn't asked before, not out of performance, but out of genuine interest in the answers. Caleb Hurst brought a behavioral methodology text to the morning briefing and left it on the table where anyone could read it. Mason Reed began keeping a supplemental log of Ghost's response patterns, not because he was required to, but because he had learned from watching someone else do it with total commitment that the careful record of a thing was a form of respect for it. The dogs felt the change. Animals always do. Ranger began eating his full morning portion. Zeus stopped breaking pattern mid-drill. Rex ran a detection sequence with Caleb that the handler log marked as the cleanest performance in 14 months of recorded work. Dr. Walsh wrote a behavioral assessment addendum that would have made the Welfare Committee's previous report look like a rough draft. She documented what she called sustained trust recovery in 3 of the animals, a process that the literature suggested typically required 12 to 18 months of intensive intervention, and noted that the timeline in these cases appeared to have compressed significantly in response to handler-animal relationship restoration, which was accurate and also the most professionally neutral way she could find to say what she had actually witnessed. 12 dogs who had been waiting for someone to come home and had behaved in their training, in their compliance, in the small daily choices of an animal about how much of itself to give to the work, like animals who knew the wait was temporary. She submitted the assessment to 3 separate oversight bodies and attached a cover note recommending that the Phantom methodology's emphasis on foundational trust architecture be considered for broader adoption across military working dog programs. She did not know whether anyone would act on it. She wrote it anyway because the record mattered and because the truth of what she had observed deserved to exist in writing, regardless of what happened to it afterward. None of these things were Iris. They were what Iris had made possible by being there, and by being exactly who she was, and by refusing, quietly, without drama, without a single moment of self-pity, to be anything less. She was ready to leave on the 4th day. The documentation was complete. The dogs were assessed and recorded and transferred into the care of an interim oversight structure that would hold through the reinstatement period. Connor had her travel authorization and the satellite phone with the new encryption key and the briefing packet for the next phase of her assignment. On the morning of the 4th day, before she went to the kennel block, she did one more thing. She found Mason Reed at the equipment bay, running his post-exercise maintenance check on the unit's communication gear. He had his sleeves rolled to the forearm and a technical schematic in one hand and a radio module in the other, and he looked up when she appeared and set both things down without being asked. She handed him a folded paper. He opened it. It was a single page from the Phantom methodology document, not classified, a training philosophy statement that the program had circulated to its handler candidates in the selection phase. She had written in the margin in the same narrow, even hand that had reproduced 3 hours of feeding logs from memory, "Read. You already understand the most important part. The rest is just practice." Ren. He read it twice. He looked at her. He did not say anything for a moment, which was the correct response. "The selection process opens in 8 months," she said. "When it does, apply. Don't talk yourself out of it first." "What if I don't pass?" he said. "Then you'll know what to work on," she said. "And you'll apply again?" She looked at him steadily. "You have ghost confidence, Mason. That is not a small credential." He looked down at the paper, back at her. "He's going to miss you." "He'll be all right," she said. "He's done it before." She paused. "So will you, both of you." She turned and walked toward the kennel block for the last time, and Mason held the folded paper in both hands and stood in the equipment bay and let the morning move around him while he processed the fact that he had just been given something he hadn't known he needed. She found Ghost first, as she always did. She spent longer at Ghost's gate than at any of the others, not doing anything different, just the palm on the head, the weight of it, the acknowledgement. Ghost stood with his shoulder pressed to the gate and his eyes half closed and his tail moving in the slow rhythm that meant what it had always meant when he was with her. She stepped back from Ghost's gate and went to each of the others in the sequence she had always used. Each one received exactly what it needed. Some needed the weight of a hand, some needed stillness. Some needed her simply to be present in the enclosure briefly, to confirm with her body what she could not confirm with language, that the absence to come was not the same as abandonment, that the work they had done together had meant what it had meant, that the record of it lived somewhere beyond files and logs and official program documentation. She had said goodbye to these animals once before. She had not expected to say it again. The fact that she was able to, that circumstance and decision and 11 months of careful, difficult work had brought her back to this specific yard, to these specific gates, to these 12 specific animals, was something she allowed herself, briefly and privately, to feel the full weight of, before she set it down and continued. When she came back to Ghost at the end, he was waiting where she had left him because that was what he did. She put her palm on his head. The 2 seconds. The weight of the hand. She pressed her forehead briefly against the opposite side of the gate. The old gesture, the one she had never given a name to because it did not require one. Ghost stayed entirely still under it, the way he had always stayed still for the things that mattered. She walked to the kennel block door. She turned around once. She had not planned to, but she did. All 12 dogs were at the fronts of their respective enclosures, 12 pairs of eyes on the door, 12 animals who had waited once before and were prepared, if necessary, to wait again. She put her hand on the doorframe and held it there for a moment. "Phantom 7, she said quietly to no one in particular, and to all of them at once. "Hold position." She walked out into the Texas morning. The vehicle was waiting at the main gate. Connor was in the driver's seat. The sealed red envelope with the appointment documentation was on the dashboard, already open. She had read it the previous evening, the night after the briefing, sitting alone with a cup of coffee in the empty command post while the base slept around her. She had read it twice. She had set it on the table and looked at it for a while without touching it. The way you look at something when the deciding is already done, and what remains is just the acknowledgement. The role they were offering was not the role she had left. It was broader. It carried more authority and more accountability and considerably more risk, because that was what happened when an institution decided to rebuild something properly. The person who built it had to bear the weight of what it became. She understood that. She had been building things and bearing their weight since her first command, and the weight was not the price of the work. It was part of the work. She had signed the acceptance form at 2,200 hours in the quiet of the empty command post, with no audience and no ceremony, because that was the only appropriate way to make a decision of this size. Connor pulled out of the gate without needing to be told which direction. He had the route already mapped, as he always did. They drove in silence for a while. The Texas landscape opened up on both sides of the highway. Somewhere behind them, Fort Caldwell was becoming smaller in the rear view, and 12 dogs in a kennel block were holding their positions the way they had always held them when she was not there. Active stillness. The posture of animals that know the difference between gone and not coming back. After 15 minutes, Connor broke the silence. "The file from Kandahar, the page 4 addendum." She looked at him. "I read it. The team that went in after the incident, 2 years before your cover assignment, they recovered something at the site that did not appear in the original after-action report." He kept his hands steady on the wheel. "It was added to the file last week. We don't know by whom, which is its own complication." "What did they find?" "A collar," Connor said. "Military specification, K9 unit designation tag." He paused. The designation was Phantom. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a person whose thinking has shifted into a gear that does not make sound. "There were 12 dogs in the program," she said. "There were 12 dogs in the documented program," Connor said. "The addendum suggests the documentation may not have been complete." She looked out the window. She thought about the files she had rebuilt from memory during 11 months of cover work. She thought about the administrative architecture of Phantom as it had existed, the intake records and the handler assignments and the training logs. She thought about whether a 13th intake was something that could have existed below the documentation threshold, classified above even the program's own administrative access level, handled by someone whose authority exceeded her own. Her satellite phone vibrated. She looked at the screen. Syria code. No name registered. The same number that had found her once before, in conditions she had resolved never to describe in a room that was not need to know. She held the phone for a moment. Then she looked at Connor. "The coordinates on page 4. Kandahar Province," he said. "Sector 7, Northeast Quadrant." "That's where the collar was found." "Yes." She looked at the phone. The screen had gone dark, the vibration complete. She waited. 20 seconds later, it vibrated again. The same number, calling back with the patience of someone who knows they will be answered. She thought about Ghost at the gate, pressing his forehead against the chain link in the amber light. She thought about Ranger on his side, breathing slow. She thought about 12 animals who had understood, before anyone with language did, that the woman cleaning their kennel was the person they had been waiting for, and who had made that understanding visible in the only way available to them, which was to refuse to move when every human authority in the yard was telling them to. She thought about loyalty as a practice rather than a feeling, as a daily choice made in small moments, without audience, without recognition, without any guarantee that the thing it was loyal to would return. She answered on the third vibration. "Ren," she said. The voice came through the encryption distortion, slightly flattened, the high frequencies stripped, but fundamentally recognizable to someone who had known it in a different context, in a different place, before the things that needed to happen had happened. "There's a situation in the northeast quadrant," the voice said, the 13th designation. Everything in her went very still in the way of someone receiving information that reorganizes everything that preceded it. "You're certain," she said, not a question, a calibration. "The caller identification is confirmed. The behavior profile matches phantom methodology exclusively. Whatever is in that quadrant," a brief pause, "it did not forget its training." She looked forward through the windshield at the road that had been taking her away from Fort Caldwell and was now, in the way of roads when the destination changes, simply the road she was on. "Connor," she said. "Yeah, turn around." She kept the phone at her ear. "Tell me everything," she said. The voice told her. The vehicle moved back along the Texas highway, pointed now toward a horizon it had already left. She had learned, in 11 months of cover work and 6 days in a Texas kennel block, that the things worth finding were always the things that had been waiting. Not hidden exactly. Patient. Holding position the way Ghost had held it every night, the way Ranger had held it for 8 months, the way all 12 of them had held it in a trench full of smoke, when every human being in the yard had been ordered to leave and not one of them had moved. Whatever the 13th was, it had been waiting too, and it had not forgotten its training. What kept 12 combat-trained military working dogs in a trench when every human being had been ordered to leave? What did they know? Before the generals, before the investigation, before the torn sleeve and the tattoo and the name spoken into a training yard full of people who had gotten it wrong? That no one else in that yard did? The answer is the oldest one. They knew who she was. They had always known. And they had waited, without complaint, without explanation, without any language at all, for the moment when everyone else caught up. In a world that measures everything by rank and record and the documented history of past performance, they measured by something that cannot be filed or classified or suspended pending review, something that does not require a paper trail or a salute or an official confirmation, something that knows what it knows. Some things, it turns out, are above classification. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the most capable person in the room is not always the loudest one, that the cost of service is often invisible until the moment it isn't, and that loyalty, real loyalty, the kind that holds its position in a trench full of smoke when the order to abandon comes, does not choose its moment. It simply holds. Drop a comment below and tell us, when did you figure out who Iris really was? The moment she walked past the equipment shed without being shown where it was? When Ghost sat down instead of backing away? When Ranger laid down on his side for the first time in 8 months? Or did the dogs know before you did?